Podcast of Poseidon is a spoiler-heavy podcast.
That's an understatement.
We're going to discuss not just the events of this book, but the Riordanverse as a whole, and really anything that we feel is relevant. You can find full spoiler warnings in the show notes. I don't want a PC. It takes up too much room.
Yeah, you in your small-ass fucking room, smaller than my room.
Too small, no PC. Can't do, won't do. Had to have a PC on my kitchen counter for several months and pandemic started. Hated that. No more.
Yeah.
No PC. Hello, mortals, monsters, and myth lovers alike. You're listening to Podcast of Poseidon, where we explore how ancient myths become modern pop culture by reading Rick Riordan's Percy Jackson and the Olympians. This is Chapter 31, Artemis. I'm your co-host, on loan from the Hunters of Artemis, Darien Smart. Joining me is my co-host and brother, hailing from the Sea of Crisis, DJ.
How's everybody doing today? The Sea of Crisis is gorgeous this time of year, and sometimes this time of month, but a lot of the times it's actually really dark. At least like half the year. The other half of the year, it's light all the time.
Mm-hmm. And DJ, where is the Sea of Crisis located?
It's on the moon?
It's on the moon.
It's on the moon.
It's on the moon.
You look at the moon and you see the big darker gray spots, and there's one gray spot that's disconnected from all of them. Yeah, that's the Sea of Crisis.
Cool. Well, do you know what's not on the moon?
What?
It's the camp store. We got to go there real quick.
Oh, okay, let's go.
All right, DJ, here we are in an episode that will be a first for Podcast of Poseidon.
What?
Do you want to guess why? Mm-hmm.
Why?
Because this is the first time we have a returning guest.
Oh, okay.
Hailing from Cabin 16, we have Skylar Barsanti, daughter of Nemesis, corporate copywriter by day, rock climber by night, and an amateur social media manager in between. Skylar, say hello.
Hello. I'm so happy to be your first repeat guest. I'm giving myself so much hype.
I think of all of the people I know, you are the one who most deserves this honor because you have been just the most utterly supportive and patient with the process. With me as your podcasting friend.
I am happy to be of service.
Awesome. So we are going to talk about Artemis because it's the next myth that pops up in the Percy Jackson books. But Skylar is here because she actually claimed dibs on the Artemis episode before we even actually started recording the podcast. So this has been a long time coming.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Nice.
And I'm very excited to do this. So let's get started with a classic. DJ, what do you remember? Actually, no. Because Skylar, you were very excited because you read the whole book in the process of this. So Skylar, what do you remember about Artemis in the Percy Jackson books?
Okay, so I read the Percy Jackson books many, many years ago. And I wanted to be super prepared for this and just I wanted your listeners to be proud of me. So I read all of the Titan's Curse in preparation for this. It was my favorite book. I remember it being my favorite of the original 5 when I read it as a much younger version of Skylar. Upon reading it again, I realized I didn't remember any of it. That is.
So you're saying that you had the same experience as Darien?
We remember the vibes, how it made us feel as young women.
But I was like, wow, I don't remember this story at all. So here's what I know about Artemis in the Titan's Curse now. She shows up in chapter 1 or 2, which shocked me because I was like, it's gonna take a while for us to introduce this character. No, we just get right into the action. She shows up with her hunters. She saves the day. She appears to Percy and his friends as a 12-year-old girl. She runs around with all these dope other huntresses. One of them's named Zoe.
Oh, so you do not steal?
Keep going. It's a podcast joke. Okay.
She loves the forest. She loves hunting. She kicks a lot of ass, and almost as soon as we meet her, she runs off, and she's like, I got some other shit I gotta take care of. So she leaves everybody behind very early on in the story. We meet her later, and she is being held captive by our story's villain, and she's trying to help Annabeth, who's also held captive by our story's villain, and who is Atlas. I didn't know should I give that away? I don't know.
Oh, that's right.
No,
this is a
we've already
point.
talked about
we
it.
actually, you may not have heard new season. We have a spoiler warning at the top of every episode.
Cool, because that's kind of like the mystery that we're like, who's behind all of the conflict in this book.
Who is Kronos' general? Who's the general?
Classic Riordan mystery. Who is the villain?
So our villain of the week in this book is Atlas. So they reveal that much later in the story. He has held Annabeth captive and Artemis captive. He's trying to get someone to hold up the sky for him. It's a terrible, terrible job. But Artemis does her Artemis thing where she rescues the young and she looks out for young, vulnerable women, in this case Annabeth, who is being held captive against her will. And that sucks. But Artemis really doesn't like boys. She doesn't like Percy very much. I think it's just kind of just because he's a boy.
Mm-hmm. But Percy's also not his best in this book.
Percy's butting heads with Thalia the whole time, so...
Does Percy suck in this one? And you were like, yeah, kind of. So Artemis is not wrong in thinking, maybe this boy kind of sucks a little bit. He's young, I get it. But over the course of the story, she sees his heroics, and at the end, she's like, don't kill those kids. Percy, you're a good man. And he's like, she didn't call me a boy because now she respects me. And that's really what we know about Artemis in the Titan's Curse. The end.
Yeah. That is...
And I read the whole thing and I'm so proud.
Thank you so much.
I read a whole kid's book. It took me a week.
Same, though.
Took me like 8 hours.
You listen to it on audiobook. During shifts at work.
Yeah, during my 12-hour shifts.
You have nothing but time.
It's pretty great.
So, yeah, I can't think of anything else that we need to touch on vis-a-vis Artemis in this conversation. The next time we really get a taste of Artemis is until Trials of Apollo. Like, she appears in the Heroes of Olympus, this like direct sequel series, Sky, but like not a lot.
She appears, but she's like stuck on the island that she would like her and Apollo were born on.
Yeah,
because like, well, it's the only island that because it's a floating island, isn't it?
Are not all islands floating?
So Artemis, no. So the island is Delos. In the, oh gosh, we're about to go into a whole thing real quick. The problem, Skylar, for the Heroes of Olympus series is that the Greek camp and the Roman camp are now clashing, and that clash is causing the gods to get issues where they're like switching between their Greek and Roman personas not at will, and they can't control like which one they're focused on. Because
everybody's praying to them at like all times.
And so it's a lot. And so the whole arc is like, how do we unify these two warring cultures? When we finally meet Artemis and Apollo again, they are on Delos, their birth island, because that is the strongest, like, this is their most, like, basically holy place. And being in this environment means they aren't switching back and forth. Like, they can be stable there. And they're also hiding from Zeus because Apollo fucked up real hard, gang.
I don't know if that's really Apollo's fault there, that a snake decided to capitalize and take back its home.
No, I'm talking about the Octavian thing.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So
Octavian manipulated Apollo, and Apollo's super easy to manipulate.
Listen,
I don't know if that's really his fault either.
You're not wrong, but you know what this episode is absolutely not about?
Apollo.
It's not about Apollo. It's about Artemis. So Artemis.
What is that, next episode? We get Apollo next episode?
We do, yes.
Hell yeah.
So hold it. So Artemis, as any sister knows, is you sometimes have to suffer people wanting to talk to you about your siblings when you just want to talk about your own accomplishments. So we've already done that. Let's start with her mythology. Right at the top, you've got Artemis, her twin brother Apollo. They were born via Zeus and his affair with Leto. And Hera's pissed, right? Pissed that the affair happened and pissed that she's pregnant.
Again, though, like, Hera, come on. Like, once a cheater, always a cheater. Come on.
Mm-hmm. No, yeah. It's rough, which we're going to have a lot of big thoughts when we do our Hera episode. But Hera's super pissed, so she punishes Leto, as she does, and basically goes to all of the island, all the land masses, everything in the world, and is like, do not let her give birth here. So Leto just can't give birth anywhere. So she's very, very pregnant and unable to give birth, and anywhere on like terra firma. So in some myths, Poseidon lends this lady a hand and he pulls up an island from the sea, but the island is not connected to the ocean floor. So it's a floating island, quite literally. It's just kind of basically bobbing along the sea, which makes it technically not part of the earth. So Leto can give birth there. Sometimes she goes there and then also has to cling to an olive tree, so she's still not touching the ground.
Okay. That's difficult.
And so it's very difficult. So once Artemis and Apollo are born, they're gods, so this act of two gods being born on this island basically roots the island in one place. And so this, in the time of ancient Greece, this island is a real place. You can go there, and did have temples to Artemis, Apollo, and Leto, essentially. So this was... Now, in the myth, the birth takes days. It sucks.
Yeah.
And sometimes Apollo is born first. Whatever. And then Artemis is born. It's way more interesting when Artemis is born first, because when that happens, the myths say she immediately turns around and helps her mother finish giving birth to Artemis's own twin brother. And this is kind of what adds to Artemis's association as a goddess. She's a goddess of many things. Most of these Greek deities were. But one of them was being the goddess of, like, pregnant parents and childbirth. For this reason.
That's crazy dramatic.
Exactly. It's crazy. This is not the version of the myth we get in the Riordanverse books, because Apollo really likes to remind you that he's Artemis's big brother.
Yeah.
And I don't know why that was the choice we made.
I'm pretty sure, I thought it was that he would say that he's the big brother because he's physically bigger than Artemis, but Artemis, like, no, I was born first, but he likes to kind of be a joker about it.
No, her response is, we're twins, we were born at the same time. He's like, I'm your big brother, though. And it's like, okay, it's not...
That's odd, though, because someone had to come first, dude. Like...
Yeah. So, and it's like, premise of the podcast, myths don't have to, there's no set in stone way, we tell them for different reasons. I just find this choice weird to have made for the Riordanverse books, specifically for the Titan's Curse, when if we have another character, Bianca D'Angelo, her whole thing is that she has a little brother that she has felt responsible for her whole life, and she wants an opportunity to be her own person away from that part of her identity that has always defined her. And so why would we not then have Artemis be the older sibling who literally was responsible for her little brother from the moment she was born, just to have kind of more of a thematic parallel?
This is 2007. Do you think he was reading that deep into his own works?
Yes, I think so. Actually, I will give him credit. He's a very good writer. It's just
he's a great writer.
Does there are a lot of thematic parallels. He does good work. It's just interesting that this was like, and the whole bickering sibling Apollo being, "Hey, little sis," is like a throwaway line compared to the. Anyway, that's it. That's all. My only critique on that point is like, thematically, it doesn't work for me because Bianca. But yeah, so in addition to being, associated with like the goddess of like childbirth and midwifery, Artemis is obviously goddess of the hunt, goddess of the wilderness. She's protector of the youth, of defenseless things. In time, she and Apollo would be designated like god of the moon and goddess of the sun. Wait, no. She's the goddess of the moon. But that is something that actually comes like way, way later and is kind of tacked on to her identity.
Yeah.
In a very interesting way, but not something I really think we're going to dive into here so much.
No, we'll probably get to it in Trials.
Yeah, I think Trials would be a good place, because that actually is where it comes up a little bit more with Apollo.
And I just love that scene where it's like, it's his dream of him reminding that he just woke up in the stable.
Yeah, he's like, oh shit, I'm here now.
Guess I'm the sun god, and Helios is just gone and forgotten.
It's
like,
fascinating.
That's fucking
it
rough.
really is. Yeah, we have, how do we want to do, there's so much, and I'm just trying to figure out what framework we want to hit on to really get into.
Well, I spoiler alert, I not only read one book for this episode, I read 2 books for this episode. Extra credit.
Fuck yeah, you did.
What did you read?
Mm-hmm.
Double A+. So I mean, we've kind of talked about, like, I'd love to talk about like the archetype, and there's truly so much you could get into. But I texted you about this, and I told you I was gonna save it because I wanted to see your reaction. I have one question.
Yes.
I have one question on
Okay.
my mind. And I would love to get through like the discussion and then present the question to the group. And I would love to hear like what you think about it, because I read a whole book. 2 whole books.
Okay.
It's my 4th book this year.
I'm so excited for your reading journey. So yeah, okay, so we're going to talk about archetypes. So then in that case, let's just knock out some groundwork about like Artemis and her like mythological, basically archetype, right? We can do a lot of things with her. So let's hit up that. DJ, I'm going to throw the ball to you if you don't mind. What do you know about Artemis as like this goddess figure? Like what are the highlights
goddess?
when you think usually I do this, but like I don't know, I'm gonna
Yeah.
We're talking about like sibling dynamic a little bit. So like what do you know about Artemis as like the goddess, this figure from like the Greek classical lore?
I hear Artemis, and obviously the main 3 come to mind is Moon, Hunter, Maiden, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's, I mean, like, and because of
The 3
Riordan,
genders.
yeah, yeah. Right. Shout out to Moon, got to be one of my favorite genders.
I definitely am Moon personally.
Yeah, and like because of the Riordan, because of Riordan, I also think, oh, well, she's got this pack of hunters, which now we know wasn't the case.
Last episode. Yeah.
Wasn't quite the case. But outside of that, there's really not much else. I mean, she shows up in Smite, obviously. She's fun. She's obviously a hunter, know. She's crit based and attack speed based, and so she's difficult to deal with.
Yes, you did have me play her the one episode when we played Smite, and it was really fun. I'm bad at video games. I'm sure I would have had way more fun if I was better.
Yeah, probably. But even then, it's a bittersweet. It's bittersweet.
Yeah.
I'm decent at the game, and even then, I'm like, oh, fuck. Oh, fuck.
And how long have you been playing Smite?
10 years?
Stellar. Go on.
Yeah, I've been playing it way too long, if you ask me. Anyway. I mean, there's really not much else that I can think of, like, Artemis being,
Yeah.
Those 3 things really are, like, the whole of what I know as Artemis to be.
And I think that's fair, because I would say like those 3 things are basically like umbrellas of her identity, and they overlap in many areas. I mean, Artemis has lots of myths. Usually we covered a lot of them last week and talking about like her connection with various like mortals and stuff. We touched on like Orion and stuff, but there's not a lot of myths about her childhood, basically what she was like as like a young goddess. But that is true for most of the Greek deities, or any deity really. There's not a lot.
The only ones that I can like maybe think of is like Dionysus, Hermes, and Zeus.
Yes, this is true. Artemis does have a story about kind of how she got her gig as the goddess she became. This 3rd century Greek poet, Callimachus, yeah, sure, why not? Who was like just kicking it in Alexandria at the time. Side note, this guy was apparently a huge fucking deal. Like, in his time, contemporary other like Greek writers quoted him as much as they quoted Homer. Like, this guy was influential with a capital.
I know I've heard of the name before, but...
Yeah. The problem is, even though he wrote over 800 works, most of them didn't survive.
That's rough.
We know about him because other people were quoting him, and then we have fragments. But one of the things he did write was basically a poem dedicated to Artemis that told of her childhood. Like, right after she's born, she goes to Zeus and she asks for 10 things. And they are, in the order that I found this written, to always remain a virgin, to have many names that set her apart from her brother, to have a bow and arrow made by the Cyclopses, who are just excellent craftsmanship. Like, that's asking for top tier stuff, and we respect you.
Because the Cyclopses are the people who make Zeus's bolts.
They do. They make Zeus's bolts. To be the light, be the light bringer. I think that has to do with the moon thing. To have a short, knee-length tunic, so she could hunt. To have 60 daughters of Oceanus, all of 9 years age, to be her choir. To have 20 nymphs as her handmaiden, and to watch her hunting dogs and her bows when she was resting. To rule all the mountains. To be assigned any city, and only to visit when called by birthing mothers. And to help women in the pains of childbirth. Now, keep in mind that this poem came way, way, way later in like terms of like Greek mythology. So it was definitely not the thing that invented any of this for her. And in fact, probably was just the thing that was like a coalescing checklist of what like
People
Greek
knew
culture
Artemis
at the time recognized.
Okay.
So yeah, goddess of the hunt, goddess of wild things, but important to mention, top of that list, to always remain a virgin. And this is something I want to touch on briefly because I remember in 6th grade social studies doing the Greek mythology thing, already being into Percy Jackson, really psyched to get to Artemis, and the teacher like covering some talking points and mentions the concept of virgin goddesses, and like half the class just breaking out into snickers. Like, oh my god, that's so fucking funny. And I mean, obviously feeling uncomfortable and frustrated by this reaction of my peers, and also the fact the teacher kind of just scrolls by. I mean, not to like, they're kids and kids are stupid, not reprimanding, but kind of what I feel like failing to elaborate on why that detail was important. Because it's not so much in the context of what would be understood about Artemis as a goddess and what she represented. The idea of her being a virgin wasn't initially a reflection on her sexuality, but on her role as a hunter.
Mm-hmm.
Because part of like the tradition of hunters was they would usually abstain from sex before a hunt as like a purity ritual, and also based on the idea that like animals can smell sex. So, you know, if you're going to be a hunt, don't have sex beforehand. And if she is the goddess of the hunt, she would embody these cultural traditions.
Yeah.
But secondly, and this is something that she would actually share with like other prominent virgin goddesses, Athena and Hestia, is a symbol of a woman's independence. In this context, like being a virgin meant you were not married, basically, right? We still have that. It's like, oh, you only have sex if you're married. If you're married, it means a man controls you. Your husband is responsible for you. Your husband dictates anything that a woman would do in this culture. And by classifying her as a virgin goddess, it basically symbolized instantly that she has no husband. There is no man who has any authority over her, save for Zeus, who is her father and already king of the gods.
Yeah.
She has this independence. And that's what these two things represent. And in time, you would kind of lose that her virginity was meant to be intertwined with those elements of her identity and became more of a commentary on her like sexuality, because later dudes would start to, you know, write Artemis's lack of sex as being an antithesis to Aphrodite. And so you kind of see them being held at odds, which is something we kind of touched on in discussing some of the myths about different mortals who wanted to reject those societal notions and go to Artemis, and Aphrodite taking that personally. Skylar, I believe you had some thoughts on the hunters and the Aphrodite cabin interaction in Titan's Curse. Do you want to lay those on us while we got you?
I have many thoughts on this. And not all of them are necessarily like a dig at Rick Riordan, because, you know, he wrote kids' books. I get it. But I'd love to introduce another source of literature that talks more, perhaps, about the Artemis archetype. It's literally called the Artemis archetype. In pop culture, this is a collection of essays edited by Susan Redington Bobby and Eileen M. Harney. Yep. Fantastic collection of essays. I enjoyed all of them, except for one, but I won't tell you which one. And it basically kind of explores examples of what, more so the Artemis archetype, like what it looks like and what it is to be an Artemis woman in pop culture. And it's super interesting. So, if I may lay some groundwork of my own, because, you know, if I was, like, writing an English essay, like, I would need, like, help defining terms. So, an archetype, I looked it up, I Googled it, is a typical example of a certain person or things, a recurrent symbol or motif in literature, art, or mythology. So, it's just, like, the more ideal version of, like, what something is more than a cliche or a trope, which would be like the opposite of an archetype.
Yeah, it'd be like that as a kind of a bad or weak thing.
Yeah, for sure. So the Artemis archetype, as kind of defined throughout the essays in this book, is characterized by a number of things. At its core, the Artemis woman, or the Artemis archetype, is the personification of an independent feminine spirit, which is super interesting. Like you were saying, like, it's not really just about one thing like sex or virginity. It is about just like the embodiment of the independent spirit and a woman fully taking ownership of like her choices and her life and all that cool stuff. So the Artemis woman, as I learned in this book very excitedly, I counted 6 things. You could combine them, but I wrote she's defined by 6 things. So the first being her relationship to wilderness and solitude. In all of these examples, you always have an Artemis character who is kind of offset from the rest of society, whether it's like the town she lives in is remote to other places, or she's literally off in another part of the world. In one example, there's an Artemis character who her story operates outside like Western culture. So that is kind of treated as like that's like the wilderness, this kind of this very kind of wild area. Number 2, her protection of victimized, powerless women and the young. We've talked about that. Mm-hmm. 3, her self-sufficiency and independence from male influence or validation, which I thought was super interesting because there are a lot of examples of characters that are very driven by how they feel or how they make men or other people feel. The Artemis woman does not need validation or influence from men, so I thought that was really cool. Number 4, her self-assuredness, as in, like, she is not a character or a person who can be remade, and that kind of has to do with that outside influence thing, but she is entirely and wholly herself without influence. Mm-hmm. Number 5, her ownership of herself sexually as well as romantically, and a lot of the examples that we found, like, there were very few examples of actual, like, virgin characters by the current, like, this societal definition of virgin. Many of them had been engaging in relationships romantically and sexually, but what sets them apart, what makes them Artemisian, is the fact that, like, she is making choice to do or not do certain things. Like, she doesn't really get attached. Like, she has a great capacity for love, but really makes very calculated and, like, very intentional choices about who she engages in those activities with. Super interesting. Mm-hmm. And then the last one, obviously, not like, it's like the last one, but it's like the obvious one, her desire to hunt. And sometimes that's kind of a metaphorical, like what she's pursuant of as a hunt, whatever her, like the character's goals or motivations are. Sometimes it's literally like murdering a-holes. Like that could also, like the literal, like the metaphorical hunt and then also the literal hunt. So the whole Artemis kind of archetype and character is defined by all 6 of these things. And a quote from one of the essays, the archetype represents a self of intactness, a one in herself, an attitude of I can take care of myself that allows a woman to function with her own self-confidence and an independent spirit. That is Artemis. That is Artemis as, like, defined by these series of essays, most, I think all of which were written by women. Mm-hmm. So they're really just, like, classifying the Artemis character as a solitary huntress and a ferocious avenger. Like, she is... You do not want to incur the wrath of an Artemis woman because she will destroy you systematically from top to bottom. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because when you talk about, like, now what we know about, like, the Artemis archetype and the Artemis character is what a lot of these essays really kind of touched on was that Artemis and Aphrodite, they're at odds, but not for the reasons Rick Riordan had represented them in The Titan's Curse. Like, Artemis and her hunters kind of represent this very, like, no boys allowed mentality, which kind of, you know, it's no boys allowed, but also they don't like girls who like nails and hair and makeup, and they're just, they're kind of he's kind of treating them as, like, one of them likes boys and the other one doesn't, which is really not doing justice to the Aphrodite-Artemis dynamic, because what I learned in these essays is that they're 2 sides of the same coin. They're at odds, but not for the reasons that Rick Riordan has presented to us, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. And then another thing about, like, the archetype is that when you talk about, like the no boys allowed mentality, is that a lot of these essays pointed out that the Artemis woman is not a woman who hates men. She is a woman who hates men who hate women. And that's kind of where she gets her protection of, like, the young and women, because young women are highly vulnerable to society's influence. They're highly vulnerable in so many ways. And that's really, she doesn't hate men. She hates men who hate women. Fair. Completely fair. So do I.
Yeah. I think we can all get behind that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So unfortunately, like, what we see in the Artemis Aphrodite kind of representation in Riordan's book really does get closer to trope than it does to archetype. And there's so little space to explore some of like the Artemis characters in the book, but when you constantly, like, when your narrator constantly makes reference to the fact that like the Aphrodite cabin can't put on their armor through their nails, and then like the Artemis cabin hasn't lost a game of capture the flag in like 500 years or whatever it is, and you're really just like setting these two up to make the audience like one over the other, which is not necessarily fair because they are at odds. And a lot of these essays explain like the Artemis woman does often fight with her more Aphrodite tendencies, and she often has to make choices that say, am I going to make this Artemisian choice or am I going to make this Aphrodite choice? Like, and that's really complicated because she really could go either way. You know, women and all people in particular, they move through these archetypes throughout their lives, throughout the situations that they face. We contain multitudes. They can be more than one.
We contain, yeah.
You know, in the Titan's Curse, like the Hunters of Artemis and the Aphrodite cabin, they're at odds, but not because one likes makeup and the other one doesn't. Which is just unfortunate, truly. I don't think Rick Riordan's ever met like a competitive cheerleader, because I absolutely believe that there are daughters of Aphrodite who do their hair and do their nails, but also could kickflip you in the face and do backflips and throw each other in the air and break ribs and smash faces, but also their hair looks great while they do it. I think you can do both.
You can be both, and that is something that I feel like we were robbed of in the representation of what the Aphrodite cabin is, and especially in this book when it is so very much being underlined as the framework being, here are the Hunters of Artemis, they're cool, they're different, they literally hang out with a goddess like all the time and are immortal and have basically superpowers and get to do these cool things. Meanwhile, here's the Aphrodite cabin, and we know they're mean because they have been said that they were bullying Percy last year when they found out that he had a Cyclops brother. And there's only one nice, like, Aphrodite camper, and it's Selena. And even in the interaction that they are having, she does not volunteer to go on the quest.
It's a shame.
And that's for, like, a lot of other reasons. Like, we can't get into it right now. Why? But also it does reflect just additional, like you're saying, it's being framed as like one is better than the other. And that sucks because there's no wrong way to be a girl.
Yeah.
No, there's not. I don't agree with the decision that he went with in the Aphrodite cabin in these books. However, this is also the height of Mean Girls and Gossip Girl and high school dramas.
Oh, it's like
the early
2007.
2000s, yeah. It's like early 2000s. Like that is the height of these kind of caricatures that
it's interesting. Like, okay, I'm not gonna like start a war here. It's interesting that you bring up Mean Girls because Mean Girls is a satire.
No, yeah, and like it is a satire, and like there's a lot of things that came out of satires.
Yeah,
especially that time.
It's weird that like this kind of like sometimes.
Mean Girl is a satire, right? But there's still these archetypes and these. Well, not archetypes, but caricatures that we see of these characters is still prevalent throughout almost all teen media at that time.
Yeah, so that's the role that the Aphrodite was cast to fill. Is they will be the quote the mean girls. They like they're Aphrodite, so they like makeup and jewelry and gossip and boys and
that's so one dimensional.
It is, and so it doesn't. But I think DJ, you do make a good point. It's like a lot of things that we reflect on is that the book, and this does not, reserve it or like rescue it from being worthy of critique, but
no.
It is
everything is you can critique anything and everything, but I do think we should take in the times.
Yes, like it doesn't excuse it, but it is like you're right. We do see that a lot, and that was just something that was put in there because I also think we have like the way the Artemis characters and like the Hunters of Artemis are cast is like not super great or like respectful for like the Artemisian Artemisian archetype either, especially in this comment that Artemis makes at some point in time where she says that like, oh, all of her hunters are very young. They're like 14 or younger, and Artemis herself usually only appears to be like 12 or 13 years old because any older and girls become, quote, like silly and they forget themselves.
Which is
they hit puberty? Like, what the fuck?
Yeah, it's a weird thing to say. Like it's a very like I don't subscribe to that way of saying, and I'm like, yes, like it is fair to put it within the context of the time that it was written in other media that was like coming out at the same time. But like, dude, like girls can like girls too. Like they can lose their hair over a lot more things than boys. Like, come on now. Like, don't reduce them to that.
It gets better.
Oh, good. A lot of the examples of like the Artemisian, like the Artemis woman from this collection of essays, like these examples are actually much older women. Like they some of them are very sexually experienced. Some of them are not very experienced. Some of them are solely focused on the hunt. One of them is like murders a bunch of dudes.
Skylar, would you like to give us some specific examples of the characters that you were engaging with and the ones I think you maybe personally particularly liked reading about or changed the viewpoint on? Let's get into pop culture.
Pop culture, some pop culture.
Podcast of Poseidon. Pop is in the name.
And we get to that segment, to the pop culture segment. So some examples of Artemis women from this collection of essays. Some of the major ones include Kara Starbuck Thrace from Battlestar Galactica. She is described as someone who very, very interestingly, like, moves throughout her story. And I didn't really watch Battlestar Galactica, but I did appreciate what this essay was saying. Is that Starbuck moves from an Aphrodite archetype to an Artemis archetype to an Aurora archetype, like triple goddess archetype here. Like her journey is incredible. And she does start out very Aphrodite, which is crazy because like you can be more of that Aphrodite kind of partner-driven person whose life or beliefs change in such a way that make them an Artemis woman. And I think that was a really good example. On top of that, you have Lisbeth Salander from The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo and The Girl Who Kicked the Hornet's Nest. Like all those, I've not read those novels. But that character that was the essay that most convinced me, like, yes, like everything about this character is like Artemis personified. Mm-hmm. Just through like her protection of like young kind of victimized people, women in particular, her like her ferocious Avenger type, the fact that like she has this like group of hackers who are like her nymphs, her Artemis nymphs who go out and like do this like crazy internet shit and catch the bad guys. She is not sexually inexperienced. Like she makes choices about who she engages in those activities with and why, and it always comes from this place of like, I am in control, this is my choice. Mm-hmm. Elizabeth is a great example of that. Michonne, I think that's how you say it, Michonne from The Walking Dead. Really good example of an Artemis figure. Literally, she roams the forest alone, like figuring out how to survive in this like zombie apocalypse. But unlike other characters in that story, like she does not kind of adopt this like motherhood persona. She acts more like this kind of like protector guide of younger characters, which is also a really interesting part of the archetype, is that like Artemis's relationship to not only childbirth but to mothers. And Artemis, there are one example of an Artemis woman who does choose like childbirth was what's her name? Zoe Washburn from Firefly and Serenity. She is an example of an Artemis woman who chooses relationship, who chooses marriage, and also chooses childbirth. What's unfortunate about that situation is that, like, her husband doesn't want to have children because of the life that they've chosen, and then in Serenity he dies, which sucks. Yeah. Apparently. So, although you have an Artemis woman who has chosen marriage and chosen childbirth, it is denied to her through circumstance, which sucks. Mm-hmm. But the Artemis woman's relationship to mothers and motherhood is also kind of something that defines her journey, which is super interesting. Because although she won't necessarily, like, she can choose to be a mother, she also kind of defaults into this, like, you might be my child, but I'm going to let you do what you want kind of thing. Like, you do whatever you want to do, and I'm here to be, you know, your protector and your example, but if you want to go run into that zombie horde, you do that. You do that. If you get into trouble, I will be there. You do you. Mm-hmm. So Starbuck, Michonne, Zoe Washburn, Lisbeth Salander, also all incredible examples of like fully kind of imagined Artemis women, which is so cool. Mm-hmm. And the one, so this book starts off with a very interesting analysis of a particular character who is highly associated with the Artemis figure, and that is our good friend Katniss Everdeen.
Oh, yeah.
The Hunger Games books. Highly associated with Artemis as a character, but really kind of only because she carries a bow, which is really limiting in, like, you know, media and really pop culture really latched on to that idea of her. But what this essay does is it breaks down, like, piece by piece, like, why Katniss is not an Artemis woman. And it's because of all these reasons I listed, like, you know, yeah, she loves the wilderness, yeah, she hunts, but, like, so much of her character is based on male influence. Like, she only learns to hunt because her dad teaches her, or she only learns to do certain things because of her relationship to Gale. She is constantly being redressed and remade by the people of the capital. She's never really truly individually herself throughout the story. And by the end of the story, she resigns herself to motherhood. She does it because Peeta wanted children, and she doesn't really make that choice for herself. So while Katniss is built up in really everybody's mind as, like, she is the Artemis character, actually she's not. She is just, like, throughout the series, like, I think, and I would hope that Suzanne Collins did this intentionally, but throughout the series that she is, like, piece by piece broken down and stripped away of the things that make her that independent feminine spirit, and turns her into something that is just completely and tragically the opposite of that, which is crazy.
I think, because I got to read half the essay before the Google Books preview kicked me out, but I think what's interesting is that, like, it wasn't when the authors are writing about how, like, you know, media latched on to Katniss and, like, cast her as, like, the Artemis archetype, like you see in, like, early books. Like, she hunts, she is a protector of young women, like her sister, Rue, in the first book, and then the Avenger, when Rue is killed, she goes after the boy that killed her, and all these things. It's really interesting, but, like, in breaking down that, like, but here are the elements of this character that show that she's not an Artemisian archetype. They never say that that's a bad thing.
No.
It's like this character is not, they don't ever, like, say, like, because she's not really one, she is not a good character. They just point out like, that she's interesting. And I think with the essay, because I didn't finish it, but you told me about it, and it felt like what they were saying is what makes this character interesting is that she's not actually an Artemis archetype, and that's her value is that and I like that. This idea that, like, a character does not have to be this archetype to be worthwhile. Like you mentioned Starbuck and how she changed through archetypes, and her final evolution wasn't the Artemis one, it was Aurora.
Yeah, exactly. Like what I loved about this is that, like, none of these essays alluded to, like, one archetype is less desirable than another, and, like, why we even kind of look at archetypes as just a way of exploring, like, characters in pop culture, but also who we are as readers and people. One of the essays said, studying the goddess archetypes can help women learn more about themselves and their choices. Women may shift goddess archetypes as they transition through life stages. And a lot of that comes from, because I want to cite it properly, a lot of that comes from the works of Dr. Jean Shinoda Bolin, works that she wrote in 1984 and 1989 that really dive into each of the goddess archetypes, which would be super interesting to read about, but because a lot of these essays reference her works. But that's why we even get into it, because none of them are really inherently bad or inherently good. They're just very, very different. And what motivates you really drives who you are as a goddess at any particular life stage. Mm-hmm. Everyone is a goddess, even you, DJ.
DJ, what goddess archetype do you feel like you're embodying this week?
Right now, I feel a lot like Morpheus, dude. I'm fucking tired.
What else is new? You're always embodying Morpheus.
Yeah, but, like, today, I have gotten, like, 4 hours of sleep a day the past 2 or 3 days. The first day, just because I stayed up too late reading manga, and today I had to get up early for, like, other stuff. Nice. So I'm just, like, super tired.
It's interesting. So I wanted to talk about kind of Artemis's the actual goddess's relationship to certain figures in her life, like Orion, like Apollo, because a lot of these essays reference they were definitely intentional in saying that, like, Artemis has a great capacity to love, but she's always kind of constantly choosing, like, am I acting out of, like, love for myself or love for my partner? Because having love for a partner or acting out of influence of a partner is a very Aphroditean trait. But a lot of these essays describe the relationship between Artemis and her partner, romantically or otherwise, as a soul twin. Like, when she chooses a relationship, she's looking for her equal. She's not looking to be better than someone. She's looking for someone who matches her in every single way, because that is the kind of person that's going to stimulate and challenge her and help her grow. and who's also going to understand those things in her and not try to hold her back from doing whatever the fuck she wants to do. Because as soon as you try to hold her back, you're trying to change her, and that's not going to work.
That's not going to, she's going to be out, done on that deal.
Yeah. So she's constantly looking, if she engages in a relationship, it's because she truly believes she's found like an equal, which I think is super dope.
Yeah, I like that. I was really excited when you said you wanted to bring you, because like I said, in my research, I mentioned in my research for the episode, I did find this book, and I thought that was really cool, but I was like, I don't have time to read it beforehand. And then you mentioned it the next day, like, I found this book, and I bought it on Kindle, and I'm going to read it. And I'm like, fuck yes, because I think archetypes as a whole are really interesting as, like, a storytelling reference point, because we talk a lot in the podcast about, like, the iterations of these characters as we see them now. And sometimes we talk about, like, oh, they use, like, the motif of the character, but it doesn't feel like the character. And I think the language we've been missing is, yeah, they used the name of the character and maybe, like, a trait, but they didn't use the archetype of the character. Like, you have this, like, idea.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. And you and I had talked about this before, is that, because I had asked you, does Artemis appear in are there other iterations of her in Riordan's books? And you had kind of mentioned a few, and you and I had discussed, I think it'd be really interesting for a full Artemis archetype, or a fuller expression of the Artemis as the actual goddess in these stories, but maybe, like, not from, like, Rick Riordan's perspective. So I think, like, and I don't want to be like, he can't do it because he's a man, but, like, if you're gonna be a man and you're gonna do it, you really, really, really gotta commit. Like, what's his name, Larson, who did the Hornet's Nest and Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. Is like they're like that. You go into, like, his history as a person and his experiences with social issues and things like that, and you begin to understand, like, oh, he went really, really, really deep into the Artemis archetype and really built an entire series of novels around that concept. And he really kind of understood it. Not to say that it's perfect, and I haven't read them, so I can't have much of an opinion more than someone who has read them. But I would love to see Artemis in the Riordanverse, in Riordan's universe, really fully explored, because I think that would be so cool. I just don't know, maybe someone else could do it. I don't know. Can he get some help? Yeah, can he consult one of the essayists, please?
Please, yeah. Can we call Shannon Hale? She's very good at writing children's literature in fantasy's twist. I think, DJ, you mentioned earlier how in later books we get a little bit more like the Artemis character, would I feel done a little bit more justice to the archetype in Trials of Apollo. Do you want to hit on that a little bit? Because we haven't gotten to talk. We are only talking about Artemis and Trials of Apollo. DJ, I'm giving you a very, very small inch to operate within. Don't overstep.
I will say the amount that I do remember about Artemis in Trials are all really her helping Apollo in any way she can. She's a sister, right? Yeah. She wants to help her brother. And it's like her brother's going through this daunting task of, like, well, he can die at any point. He's never done this. I've never done that. I'm very worried for him.
Yes.
And so it might stand, like, aside from what you guys have been talking about. A lot of the times she's standing next to Zeus, kind of like pleading to Zeus, like, dude, he's been through enough. Please just, like, let him come back. He's like, nah, he's not done yet. Even though Zeus has no idea where this is going to go.
Fuck Zeus. Yeah, no, I think, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah, in Trials of Apollo, for the major fuck up of Apollo in the Heroes of Olympus series, as we touched on earlier, Zeus strips Apollo of his godhood, and he's not even a demigod, he's a mortal, and then casts him to Earth and is like, you fucked up, you gotta fix it. And he's like, fix what the fuck? And it is a great book. I actually love this
wonderful
series. I think it's so fun.
My favorite.
I think the first Apollo as a character sucks initially.
Because it's Apollo, right?
And it's because you're in this character's head and he's a douche. He gets better though. It's like reading the Artemis Fowl books. He gets better. But in that way, so he's a victimized character, because we also get a lot in. Well, oh shit! I said we had an inch, and But to talking about our
reel it in, wrap it up.
But in discussing Artemis as her archetype and being someone who protects like who looks after victimized characters, we see in Trials of Apollo how Zeus is set up to be an abusive father. Like not just as a cold, withdrawn,
no, like a
parent.
genuine abusive father.
He is described as being an abuser, like to Apollo, and this has been, and we get the sense that this is not the relationship that Artemis has with Zeus, simultaneously being like, she has probably never been his victim because she has often separated herself from the rest of the Olympians a lot. In the sense that, like, Apollo, like you said, like, he is the victim and she is trying to protect him, even though she is not able to do so until much later because there were things out of her control, but also in the other ways that it expands a little bit more on the Artemis archetype beyond her whole, like, no boys allowed and, like, girls, like, are silly and forget themselves when they like boys. Apollo mentions that sometimes because in the Percy Jackson books, it's implied she never appears older than 13. Apollo mentions that he likes to appear at any age he feels like, but Artemis, he'll like, I'll be 30, I'll be 60, depends on what my mood is. Am I going to a jazz bar? But Artemis, he notes, she usually never appears older than 20, which I like more than her only being 12. I think there's still like that because she wants to appear the age of her followers.
Yeah.
For that, like, sense of community. And I think there's a little bit more of a comfort level in that it is not about prepubescent, but more about the youth and experience of life that she is the guardian of. And simultaneously, in the Trials of Apollo series, you meet a lesbian couple, these two older women who have been, like, married since, like, the 80s, and they used to be hunters. That's where they met. And then in time when they fell in love, they went to Artemis and they're like, we can't maintain our vows to you because the vow is like no romance. And that expands a little bit more than in Titan's Curse where it's just no men. And it's like no men, but no romance. And I do like this take a little bit more because I think it falls into not so much like this is no boys allowed, but a little bit more like if you're going to follow a deity, the followers are often expected to live like that deity does. And so for Artemis, if her whole thing is like goddess, like virgin goddess, no romance, her followers are expected to do the same, regardless of sex or gender. So I like that a little bit more. Do I love it? No. But I will acknowledge that a lot of the things that I don't like the most about how Rick Riordan does Artemis in 2007 are much... I think we see a lot of, like, growth and reflection and a little bit more acknowledgement of this idea of, like, this Artemis archetype in 2020.
Yeah. And I would love to see, like, a Riordanverse, like, Artemis story where she is changing, like, she is wholly herself, but she is kind of maybe changing her appearance to reflect, like, who she's interacting with. Like I said, many of the, like, these great examples, like, these are women of all ages and all experiences. And I would love to see, like, her nymphs are, like, I'd love to see, like, hunters in, like, their mid-60s. I would love to see hunters at age 10. Like, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I would love to just see, like, more Artemis characters, or at least this Artemis character, treated as the more true expression of, like, what it actually means to be an independent feminine spirit. Because it means so many things.
Yeah.
It really does. So you said you had a question for us.
I do. And, you know, feel free to, like, gasp when you hear it because I need it to be hyped up.
Okay.
So from our discussion of the Artemis archetype, knowing that, like, she is defined by her relationship to wilderness and solitude, her protection of of victimized powerless women and the young, her self-sufficiency, her desire to hunt, her full ownership of herself romantically and sexually, her self-assuredness. As I was reading these articles and these essays, the one question I had to myself, and this is the question that we need answered, is Riordan's Artemis even an Artemis? Dun dun dun. That's the big question. And that's not a question to criticize. Because as a young person and even, like, as an adult who has not been trained to recognize these archetypes in pop culture, I would think of the Artemis character. The only example I would have of the Artemis character is Riordan's example. But I was like, but is this Artemis even an Artemis? What do you think? I'm curious to know.
It's interesting because I think across the board, the characters of mythology that we get in the Riordanverse are so very flat. Like, they're not archetypes, they're often tropes of themselves.
Yeah.
So
one could argue that Apollo or Hermes, or even Zeus for that matter, aren't really reflective of their own myths and their own archetypes, you know?
What we talk about all the time, Aphrodite is certainly not an Aphrodite archetype.
No.
But with the Artemis one, I could say we definitely talk about, like, she's a little bit, like, is she the most fully realized version of the Artemis archetype? No, but I based on the 6 criteria you've given, I'm not sure she does anything that would dramatically demand that she's not. Because, I mean, obviously you have the hunt, right? You have... Read us off the 6.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I know it's difficult because we see so little of her in this.
Yeah. Well, DJ and I are pulling from all of... Yeah, DJ and I are now pulling from everything.
Okay, so the six defining characteristics of an Artemis woman. She is defined by her relationship to the wilderness or solitude. She likes to be by herself.
Okay.
Her protection of victimized, powerless women and the young. Her self-sufficiency and independence from male influence or validation. Her self-assuredness, i.e. she cannot be remade. She is only the image of herself that she creates. 5th being her ownership of herself sexually and romantically. The 6th is her desire to hunt or pursue. Her goals or people or animals or whatever it is she's hunting.
Yeah. I mean, given those criteria, I'd say Artemis is.
I would, yeah, because we don't get a lot of her in the first one, but we get, like, the other things we touch on her, like, the solitude thing, like, she definitely spends more time away from the Olympians. Like you said, like, she will not be with her hunters when there are things she has to do. I think the only one that I'm almost like, is this version of Artemis not, is that, like, her the lack of influence of men. Not to say, like, any of, like, these demigods or mortals or, like, Orion or anybody else, but, like, there's very much the ever-presence of Zeus that she has to appease as, like, you know, the father, the king of the gods, especially in Trials of Apollo when we are hyper-aware that she wants to help her brother.
Yeah.
She wants to help Apollo, and she has been told by Zeus that she can't, so she doesn't.
But I mean, I feel like that's kind of entirely different, right? That's like me wanting to... gonna use an extreme bit here, wanting to rob a bank, but a policeman tells me I can't.
Okay, hold on. I actually don't agree with that,
that's
because that is a wrong thing to do.
That is an authority figure telling me I cannot do something.
Okay, are you trying to rob a bank because you want the money to feed your family because they're dying of hunger?
It's still wrong to do.
A police officer, if you could rob the bank before you tried to rob it?
And it doesn't, like, all of these, it's like, it's still wrong to do because the authority says no. And I'm not saying we should always listen to the authorities. However, it's still something that needs to be taken into consideration. I wouldn't say that's, like, if it was her, if Zeus was a woman, would this change the dynamic in any way, shape, or form?
No, but Zeus isn't a woman, so that does not.
You're right, he's not, but it's still, like...
It's still, well, because here's the thing I think about it is that in Heroes of Olympus, the reason they're on Delos is Apollo's in fucking trouble for the Octavian incident. And Artemis is also in trouble because Zeus told the gods not to have any contact with the demigods, no mortal contact at all anymore. And she was still running with her hunters. So she's in trouble there. So in this case, she disregarded Zeus's, like, fuck it, whatever. And then as soon as to be fair, when things break really bad, she and her brother go skip to somewhere safe. And I don't think that doesn't make her Artemisian. I think her refusal to let her father or let, like, the authority tell her she can't be with her hunters is an Artemisian character. But I think the reason that she doesn't help Apollo is the fear of punishment. Like, she was more than willing to defy Zeus in Heroes of Olympus, but in Trials of Apollo, the gods have been shown what Zeus will do to them. And based on what happened to Apollo, he's not a god. Yeah. And he's suffering immensely.
He bleeds red blood. He doesn't bleed ichor.
He can't even have ambrosia and nectar that the demigods can eat to heal themselves. Like, he is at a major disadvantage.
The only thing he gets is very brief spouts of divinity.
Mm-hmm. When he actually, which I would say definitely, we can't. No, stop. No.
Damn.
Stop it. So, but in terms of Artemis, I think you have this complicated thing where, like, she's a goddess and stuff, but she fears for her independence in that if she, maybe in this case, if she defies Zeus to help Apollo and then loses her own divinity, does that in turn cost her ability to be independent? She no longer has the power to protect herself or her hunters. And so in this case, it is kind of made. And in the Percy Jackson book specifically, that story I mentioned earlier about Artemis going to Zeus and asking for those 10 things, that is canon in the Percy Jackson books. Like in Percy Jackson and the Olympian Gods, there's a bunch of stories that Percy tells about the gods, and this is one of them, and these are presented as fact. Here's the shit that actually happened. So in this instance, Artemis only has her identity through her father allowing it. And that sucks, but also reflects what we kind of talked about with the Hunters of Artemis, in that there are no mortal women who tend to have happy stories when they try to follow Artemis, because Artemis was not meant to be an archetype for real women to grasp onto in this culture, in these ancient
really no
times.
gods were meant to be an archetype for real people to grasp on.
That was true, although I would say like Zeus being an asshole and then actual Greek kings getting to be an asshole is different, because
those
really
are
did get
kings.
away with. It's true.
Those are kings. Like,
Those are
again,
kings.
as much as I'd like to hold them to the same standard as somebody on the same ground, kings are a bit above
fair.
it all.
So I think, especially when I compare Artemis in the Riordan books to the absolute smear campaign that is Aphrodite, I think, yes, I think Riordan's Artemis is an Artemisian archetype, though I would say she is perhaps not a fully fleshed out character. But that could be argued for all the gods, because I think
it could be argued for most characters that aren't in the main spotlight. You know,
but like it's like none of these godly characters are meant to be idolized.
Yeah,
like the whole premise of these books again and again is like how the gods fuck up and fail, and how these demigods have to clean up their messes. And so when Artemis kind of like behaves in certain ways that is like promoting one version of a girl over another, isn't meant to be taken as a thesis statement on this is the way women should behave, because it is coming from a character who is not meant to be representative of how any of these demigods should behave, because the gods can't be relied upon to set positive examples, even though Artemis, we would say, is better than most of them, because at least she doesn't let them get killed.
Yeah. And if they do die, she honors them in some way.
She does. She does turn Zoe Nightshade into a constellation. It's very sad and very cool.
Yes.
So you hear that, kids? Just because you read these books, you can like Aphrodite doesn't mean you have to be mean. You can be an Artemis, and it doesn't mean you have to hate boys. Mm-hmm. You don't have to do that. There are much greater and much more colorful examples of people who are embodying these characteristics and these traits that you initially admire from these particular Riordan stories out there in the world, in other stories, which is what this collection of essays taught me. Because I'd have gone my whole life thinking this Artemis was the only Artemis. That's not true.
That's not true, no. We'll definitely put the full title of the book of essays, if you'd like to check it out, at your local library or wherever you get your fine books.
Yeah, it had 3 reviews on Kindle, so I don't think many people have read it, and I think that's a dang shame, because it was super interesting. And you could read whole books about every goddess archetype, and you could just learn so much about yourself as a person. Highly recommended.
It's good. I like archetypes, especially in our podcast. We talk about like storytelling and stuff.
Can I drop a Taylor Swift fun fact into this conversation? And you can just put it out there however you want. I just want to share it with the world. Okay, so the Roman writer Strabo, that's a name. Not Starbo, which is how I read it originally, because I don't have a brain sometimes. Strabo offered one meaning for the name Artemis. Artemis meaning safe and sound. Taylor Swift wrote a song called Safe and Sound for the first Hunger Games film, which was billed under the pseudonym Artemis. In conclusion, Taylor Swift is a genius.
Nice.
Classic. Well, we know this. This isn't Fatal Flaw, but we knew that here. At least we know that here.
It's fucking genius. The way I screamed when I read that, it was late at night, so it was in my head, but the way I screamed when I read that.
That's very, very good. I don't think hold on. Let me.
I could argue that Aloy from Horizon Zero Dawn's an Artemisian character. She lives for the hunt. She was taught by her father, surrogate father. She doesn't really like the tribe that she kind of has to join in order to be able to survive in this cutthroat world, because this tribe, has shunned her for so long.
Mm-hmm.
And so when she finally gets a part of it, she takes the moment she can to leave.
It's very Artemisian, I would say, based on what we've learned today.
Yeah. But yeah, she's a hunter. She's very relatively independent, very good at what she does because, player, but also within the lore.
Yeah, I like that. I think you're onto something, DJ. Because I gotta do Lumberjanes real quick. Artemis does appear in Lumberjanes. Now, is she an Artemisian archetype? I would say not by the definitions we have explored here today.
Yeah.
But she is canonically Ace Arrow, and as an ace myself, I just have to be like, there it is. Shout it out.
Hell yeah.
I think she's supposed to be canonically Ace Arrow in the Riordan books, but they never actually say that, so... Also, NASA is currently working on the Artemis space missions to send folks to the moon and Mars, including getting the first woman and the first person of color to the moon and establishing a lunar moon base. And I just really needed to mention that because I like space shit a lot. And also...
God, a lunar moon base would be fucking dope.
Yeah, and also it's about goddamn time the moon missions were called the Artemis missions.
Yeah. The way I viewed it was, is Apollo going to check on his sister Artemis?
That's really cute.
Because they send the Juno missions.
I was about to say the Juno space probe to check on the moons of Jupiter.
Yeah, so
fucking, they're all a bunch of nerds. It's great.
Moons are named after Jupiter's mistresses.
They are. It's a whole fucking thing, and I do love space and space.
Space is great. Very excited for space.
I'm very excited for space. Awesome.
Very excited for space. Also very fearful for space.
It's just also a true thing. Space is great and should be feared. Like, I believe, Skylar, you would say the ocean.
Yeah, the ocean is terrifying.
Yeah.
Have you seen any of those videos that are like, I've seen these like reels and TikToks that are like, this is how dark it is at night on a boat. And it's terrifying, actually.
Yeah. Well, I am glad we got to talk about the moon a little bit on our Moon Goddess episode. This is very good.
The start and end of it. Let's go.
I do like a little bit how, like I touched on earlier, was like, yeah, she's a moon goddess, but that came way later and is not super like woven into her like stories all that often. And then in our Artemisian archetypes, moon not compatible. Basically, don't worry about the moon.
Yeah, we don't need to worry about the moon or tides.
It's fine. Awesome. Well, Skylar, with that, I believe that concludes our quest for Artemis. Let's swing by the big house real quick and you can show off your trophies. Is there anything you'd like to plug while we got you?
Oh my gosh, I don't do anything interesting. I run a rock climbing Instagram page called On the Rocks Boise. You can see the full backside of me because you can't see when I'm climbing from the front. So you won't really know that it's me, but trust me, it's me. And it's also Darien. And it's very fun, and I hope we've all learned so much about ourselves as Artemis women, about the Artemisian women inside all of us. And boys, don't be afraid of the Artemis woman, but don't piss her off either. That's all I can say.
Don't piss her off.
Yeah, very true.
Skylar, thank you so much for joining us. This has been just super fun. I was so excited to have you come back on the pod to talk about Artemis, and thank you so much for taking the time to share these Artemisian archetypes. I think having the notion of archetype is really going to elevate the podcast going forward because it's something I want us to continue to explore. DJ, what do you think?
I enjoy Artemis as a character and most things that I see her in. She's a lot of fun, and I like her as a god.
Fantastic. Well, Skylar, thank you again.
Thank you so much for joining us, Skylar.
Oh, yeah.
And we will be back in your ears on Tuesday, March 1st to talk about Artemis' twin brother, Apollo, and try desperately not to let DJ talk about the Trials of Apollo series.
You're just not going to succeed there. Thank you guys so much for joining us.
And until next time, Don't be like Zeus.
Don't be like Zeus.
Podcast of Poseidon is created and hosted by Darien and DJ Smart. It's edited by Darien Smart. The show is produced by Darien and DJ Smart, as well as
Tim O'Connor.
The Crystal Con Man.
Our music is Athens Festival by Martin Hain, and our cover art is by Audrey Miller. You can find her on Instagram at bombshellnutshellart.
Like the show? Ready for more? Support Podcast of Poseidon on Patreon. Just $1 gets you exclusive bonus content. Find out more at patreon.com/podcastofposeidon.
Can't spare the drachmas? You can support the show by leaving a review on Apple Podcast or by sharing us with your friends. Find all of our episodes and episode transcripts at podcastofposeidon.com.
Thanks for listening.